Matthew Davies, production designer for 5 Days at Memorial. This is about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, specifically at Memorial Hospital. So I imagine the book was a hugely valuable resource, but where do you even begin with a project of this magnitude?
It was actually a huge undertaking. Just the amount of information that is in the book, but also, I guess most, stories have a single storyteller. In our case, it really felt, though John Ridley and Carlton Cuse had written these phenomenal scripts, it felt like it was Sherry Fink's story as our producer and the writer of the novel. And she actually provided all of her assets that went into the novel. And I think there was something like 3,200 individual assets. So that included everything from layouts of the hospital to photographs. A lot of them were date stamped. So we set about carefully reconstructing the order of events at Memorial, the escape routes that people took. We really had to go down the rabbit hole to understand really, what actually happened in the hospital in almost forensic detail before we could begin designing the show. So it was probably the biggest undertaking of that kind that I've ever done. And my department, first time I really worked with archivists and researchers on that level. We had just so much information to go through before we could begin designing it.
Mm-hmm. So obviously the main set is the hospital set. So how diligently did you recreate the whole structure? It looked like a real hospital. Like I know it still exists there, but it's a different hospital now, obviously. So what went into design of the hospital?
The hospital exterior is pretty much identical to the real hospital. Anyone that works at Oxford Baptist, as it is now called, would recognize their place of work. We did 3 weeks of lidering in New Orleans and collecting drone footage. And, it was just, like I said, it was a massive undertaking to really unpick all of the events at Memorial Hospital, the exact geography of the interior, and then to recreate that in studio. And we, different producers had this property at different points in time. I believe that Scott Rudin and Brian Murphy were producers at one point, and everyone faced the same issues, which is how do you make this story? Because it's so big and complex. It happens at a micro and macro scale. You're looking at what's going on in the city and the collapsing levees. You're inside the hospital, dealing with these very kind of intimate human kind of portraits. And so we ended up spending quite a bit of time in prep, just with Sherry and the producers and writers and directors, just trying to work out every detail of the story and trying to make those 5 days as realistic and as truthful as we could be. And in the end, we built I think a 27,000 square foot outdoor tank, and we built a 30,000 square foot interior hospital environment that all had to be rigged for hurricane conditions. So we had, fans and drip trays and drip rigs and all these things going at the same time. And then we had to track the deterioration of the hospital over the 5 days as well. So we had 5 levels of breakdown that we had to achieve as well. So,
So how many parts of it did you construct? Did you just do it like floor by floor, including the helipad?
Yeah, so different people took different routes for escape from the hospital. Some people were airlifted from the helipad. It was a torturous route getting to the helipad. They had to go down from, there was a ICU on the 8th floor. There was life care on the 7th floor. There were all the other various administrative parts of the hospital. They had to go down to the 2nd floor, squeeze through a narrow hole into the parking garage, and then loaded into pickup trucks. They were taken up the ramps to the bottom of the helipad, and then they had to climb a 40-foot staircase to get up to the top of the helipad. So we actually built all of the elements, 15,000 square foot helipad, the stairs in their entirety, like everything had to be built in pieces and then composited back together.
So the staircase was actually connected to the helipad?
No, it was built
No.
right next to it.
Right next
So we built the helipad in the field. It was built 6 feet tall. We had telehandlers with digi-blue screen kind of wrapping 3 sides of it. The fourth wall was a wall of the physical wall of the hospital that we built that connected to the helipad. And then right next to it, we pile drove footings for a 40-foot practical staircase so that actors could actually climb the full extent of it. And that was for a very particular camera move that John Ridley wanted to do, that pulled out from under the staircase and came right up to the top to meet with the helipad. So yeah, there was a lot of Viva's work involved.
That's insane. Well, on the ground level, it's the ambulance ramp, and for most of the show, it's flooded, and we see like boats. And I'm assuming that's the part where you build in a tank, a water tank.
Yes, so we built a 27,000 square foot outdoor tank that could be filled up to 4'6" in depth, and all that water had to be filtered and heated and dyed, and just sort of managing that and the various water levels with the raising and lowering of the water levels all had to be worked out in advance. So I sat down with Libby Miller, our first AD, for about 2 weeks, and we unpicked the entire shooting schedule to work out what we could deliver and when.
Wow. Well, like you said, like the looks of the sets are not static, because you have to show how it deteriorates over 5 days. So I guess, how do you build things that are supposed to fall apart eventually? Like, I mean, even in the first episode, like the walkway is about to collapse when they're trying to run through it, when the storm is hitting. So yeah, how do you go about doing that?
So the walkway was actually built as part of a huge composite environment that included exteriors and interiors all in studio. The actual walkway itself was set onto airbags and gimbals, and it could be basically manipulated to create the rock and tilt motions of the walkway under hurricane conditions. At the same time as we had our real actors running across it with smashing glass, which all had to be controlled, debris flying through camera. Everything we did, we tried to do as practically and to make it as real as possible, so that the actors' reactions would be real and in the moment. John Ridley is very much about method, and he wanted all of the geographic routes that people took during the evacuation to actually kind of mirror the actual routes. It was very much it was a big exercise in unpicking this disaster to a level where we knew where everybody was in the hospital at any point in time, and then reconstructed their journeys as faithfully as we could. The interior is a little bit different to the actual hospital, but the tone and flavor of it is very much identical. The color schemes, the deterioration, as you said, we had 5 levels of deterioration that we had to track through the 5 days immediately post-storm. We had the storm itself to deal with, and then there was the aftermath where the levees broke and the city filled like a big bowl of water. And then it became about the escape of the 2,000 people that were trapped in the hospital over the 5 days following the storm.
Mm-hmm. How did you guys recreate the levees breaking and the flooding? How much of that was CGI?
It's interesting. A lot of the footage that people see in the show and they think, oh, this is found footage. It wasn't actually
the news footage.
There wasn't as much footage as we thought there was. I remember seeing a lot more at the time than actually we could sort of source. I guess the world was kind of slow to realize what was really happening in New Orleans. People were trapped outside of the extent of the floodwaters. There was helicopter footage from the time that we did, base a lot of those shots on, but the resolution of televisions back then was nothing like the HD today. It wasn't 16:9, it was like 133 aspect. It was completely different. And we realized very early on that what we assumed would be a wealth of footage just really wasn't there. So we had to then set about recreating all of that from assets. So we actually built a lot of those physical assets in our tank once we'd finished shooting the hospital exterior scenes, so we'd get interaction with actors and water and reflections in the water and everything else. And then we took all of those elements and then composited back together. So it was a real marriage of physical elements for compositing work.
You created your own footage, your own news footage.
We basically did, yeah, we had to do that.
Yeah. Well, lastly, have you gotten any feedback from the people who were at Memorial back then about the show?
Not from the individuals themselves who work there. Obviously, legally it's a very delicate thing to make to recreate a disaster of this nature, where it involves a lot of living people that were very much implicated in various aspects of the aftermath of this. But what was very rewarding was actually listening to the actors. And Julianne Emery she played Diane Robichaux, and she gave a really beautiful and eloquent account of how a lot of her motivation as an actor. And I think Cherry Jones and Vera Farmiga said the same thing, that the sets actually, being in that environment, it was much easier to kind of connect to or to empathize with the characters and what they were going through, because what we created was so realistic and so true to what those original people had been through. And so that was a big part of their motivation and their performances, and that was very rewarding for the art department to hear that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for your time. It was great speaking with you, and we'll see you back here in a little bit. Ramsey Avery, production designer for The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Were you a big Lord of the Rings fan before this?
I was actually. I got introduced when I was a kid, about 10 years old, and it really was actually a very important part of my geeky young life and into teenagerhood. So definitely an underpinning, kind of in many ways, got me introduced into the whole world of fantasy and science fiction, which has kind of guided my whole career since.
So how stoked were you when you got this gig?
Very, very, very excited.
Well, I mean, there's obviously the books and the movies, but the show takes place in the Second Age, not the Third Age. So this is like the kingdoms in their heyday, and they're thriving. So what kind of inspirations did you take, even from the movies themselves? Because like that shows like the aftermath when they're kind of like deteriorating.
Yeah, it's it a little bit of all of that, actually. The trick really was to try to figure out what is like John Howe, one of the illustrators who's worked on a lot of these projects, was defined it as trying to figure out what the DNA of Middle Earth would be and how we could grab onto that component for our world. It was very important to differentiate our Second Age from the Third Age, in that it really is, the Third Age is about the decay and the decline, and the Second Age is to be glorious. And looking at all these different cultures at the height of their capacities and their capabilities. And that took the effort of acknowledging what lives in the films, because that's what the audience understands that it's going to. So you have to recognize that is what's in people's heads. But then we went back as far as going into Tolkien's drawings themselves to see what he thought things looked like, and then looked at all the other artists, all the way starting back from when I was a kid. The brothers Hildebrandt was what Middle Earth looked like. And that's not really what Middle Earth looks like now. And people said it looks much more like Alan Lee and John Howe's version of it. And there's Ted Naismith in the middle of all of that, and a whole bunch of other artists through there. So trying to pick through all of those different artists and those different representations and figure out what it is that makes Middle Earth feel epic and also feel lived in. That's one of the things that's really important. I think it works well in the movies, and I think it's really important in the books. Is like sometimes what Sam and Frodo had for lunch in the middle of nowhere. So that kind of specificity in terms of the world building, making sure that we could find what those elements were in what we brought to the Second Age.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's Second Breakfast, right?
Yes, and Second Breakfast, true.
Yeah,
yes.
Second Breakfast. Yeah, well, there's also so many different kingdoms to keep track of too. But how did you go about differentiating the different cultures? Like obviously there's the elves, and it's more natural, their look, and then the dwarves, like their domiciles are grittier, and then there's a Numenor, which we've never even seen before. This like Atlantis-like world. So what was your approach to them?
A couple of steps for that. One was to try to figure out what we thought were the cultural key points for each culture. In that, like you said, each of these races come from someplace, and they come from someplace in Tolkien's words. So you can look back into that history. The elves first appeared when there wasn't even a sun or a moon. There were just stars in the sky, and they appeared in a forest, and they lived in that forest for time unmeasured, really. And so the idea that that's the basis of their sense of the world is stars and trees and nature, and everything kind of springs from that, as opposed to the dwarves, which are described, Tolkien says they're of stone and of flame. And so the idea that you look into those elements to see what the baseline of that is. And Harfoots, we know, have to hide and they have to be able to be furtive. So how does that translate into what their world would look like? And the Númenóreans build, and they are the most glorious development of a kind of representation of human as that you can imagine. And so what do those types of elements mean, just in terms of the basic underlying characteristic of each culture? And then looking into our real world to see what are the things that are cognates for that. How do we do nature that suggests architecture and forms and ornament of nature that doesn't get to Art Nouveau, but has that kind of resonance with Art Nouveau? So we, as people in the audience, can kind of recognize what it's about, but still understand that it's not 19th century France. It is Second Age Linden, and finding those differentials. Like we would take bits of Art Nouveau and blend it with Latin Celtic ancient architecture, and then look at photos of hyper macro photography of plants and try to figure out what's the kind of geometric blocks out of that we can take and build an ornament for Linden out of. So it was basically taking each culture, finding that underlining characteristic to define the culture, looking for real world elements in our history that we could relate to, massaging those ideas together, and then making sure that it fit within the story, because it could look as great as it wanted to look, but if it didn't tell the emotional beat of each scene that we were trying to get it to tell, it wasn't serving its purpose.
Mm-hmm, sure. Well, Numenor specifically, it's so striking, and when they just enter it, it's so grand. So how many sets of that did you guys build? And the backstory of that is also like it's like men have descended on it now, and like the elves were there first, so it's like you have to do like the clash in cultures of that too. So what went into those designs?
Well, I guess there's kind of two questions in there. In terms of that, we developed a whole 3,000-year history of how architecture and ornament and culture evolved from the Elvish influence and the Valar helping the humans, and how that shifted over time to become less and less elven and more human. And what that looked like at each step of the way. We had 4 different ages of architecture that we defined with either illustration or with reference and with words to help that define its way, color, so that you could see how it started at the lower levels being more elvish, and as it went up higher on the cliffs, it got more mannish. Then in terms of what we built about a 4.5 acre backlot set for the city itself, which had streets and plazas and alleys and a wharf. All of that had to be able to turn into other things. The wharf actually became the Cantina Bridge. That the plaza became 3 different streets. So it was a matter of figuring out how to do one kind of unit backlot set that we could translate into a whole different parts of the city. And then we built multiple interior components. There was the court, there was the king's bedroom, which was turned into the Palantir room, and also a later scene in Eregion. We did the court and the king's bedroom, and then we did the prow dining room, which is kind of at the end of that big waterfall at the top of it. So we looked at those kind of components to what we could build and how we could repurpose it into other sets as well. Mm-hmm. The Hall of Lore is actually the dungeon, which is actually Celebrimber's workshop. So we ended up having
I love that workshop. It's like all the trinkets in there. It's like of a different time. I mean, like, yeah, but it's like it feels like a toy shop, I guess.
And that was part of that was too. We actually ended up having to do Celebrimber's workshop in there because we ran out of money to do another big set for that. So we had to figure out what we could use to turn into that. So that's how could we take the spareness of what we had done with the other 2 versions of the set and make it more feel like Celebrimber, the greatest craftsman of his age, had developed that into something that he felt comfortable in.
Mm-hmm. And I understand you guys built a ship too.
Yes, actually we built 2 ships. One of them was for the first trip to Valinor, the one that Galadriel jumps off of. And then we built a second ship that was the Numenorian ship, which was about 120 feet long-ish with all the gearing on it. And then it was on a gimbal, 6-axis gimbal, and it had the bottom 20 feet of sails on it, so they could actually be practical rigging with the sails. Pretty amazing when we finally got it there and started the big wind machines blowing on it and waves, water machines, waves crashing onto it. We had actual sailors as extras, so they knew how to do the real rigging with it. It was really kind of a moment when they first that all started to come together, was just a remarkably magical moment.
That's awesome. Well, season 1 filmed in New Zealand. Season 2 is going to be in England, or filming in England. Are you returning for the second season?
No, I'm not. All the scheduling stuff didn't work out for that, so I'm off into a whole different franchise.
Well, what do you hope to see as just a fan of season 2, and how they build upon your sets?
Well,
you do that handoff.
There were lots of things that we knew things were going to go south for both Numenor and for Eregion, right? So a lot of the talking that the showrunners and I did were talking about how we could develop it, looking into those future happenings. And I'm sure that things will shift and morph. So I'm very curious to see how those kind of kernels of ideas that we established in season 1 carry out into season 2 and season 3. Definitely Rune. I'm very excited to see what they do when they go to Rune. That was something we actually started to do in season 1, and then we let that drop away. We had too much going on in our season, so that was one of the storylines that shifted. So I'm very curious to see how that gets approached. Something again like Numenor, something we've never seen any representation of in a movie or a TV show. So I'll be really curious to see how that comes to life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Ramsey, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
Cool.
Thank you. Mark Scruton, production designer for Netflix's Wednesday. What is your history with the Addams Family? Were you a fan before this?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I loved the TV show when I was younger, growing up. Because when I think it was always on, and it sort of burrows into your head as part of your history. And I think the films as well were, they were definitely favorites when I was a kid growing up.
Well, Tim Burton directs the first 4 episodes. So what were your conversations with him about the look of the show, and specifically like the Nevermore Academy set, which is where a lot of the action is?
Yeah, it was, I think starting out, the scripts that Miles Miller and Al Goff had written were really great in laying out the intentions. And when I started to talk to Tim about it, it became very clear that he had a lot of empathy with the whole world of Nevermore and the characters within it. So we really wanted to create a space that reflected that melting pot of sort of outcast cultures and people, and to create something that was visually interesting and had very lots of different levels to it. So there was sort of different styles of architecture, different elements of spaces, so very small closeted spaces, very big open expanses, but all the time wanting it to feel like a real school. So trying to bring it back to a more personal, relatable level that, you remember elements of the school as a child, and you can still feel that without the grandeur sort of taking over and making it all seem unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, the exterior, at least, it looks like this gigantic Gothic mansion. So was that a real building? I know you guys shot in Romania. The exterior.
It was yeah. I mean, we looked at different countries. We started in Toronto and we sort of moved around a bit. We ended up in Romania, and we looked at a lot of different castles and palaces and environments to sort of base it on. We ended up with Cantacuzino, which was the one you see in the show. Now, actually, really, there was not a lot of it left by the time we finished adding and enhancing and moving around with it. We used the location. We went there for about 3 or 4 days. We shot a lot of the exterior stuff around the front of the building. But it was really just a spring point. We then took it, and there was a sort of a central column that Tim really hooked in on, which had that sort of Addams Family quality to it without it being a direct reference to it. And I think that was the linchpin for everything else. And it grew beyond that. And we took lots of different elements of architecture, sort of Moorish architecture and Ottoman and brutalist. And a lot of that was led actually from my time working in Romania when I first got there. We hadn't really planned to go down that route, but actually when I got there, the mix of architecture in Romania is so varied, and it's all sort of crammed together in this glorious collage of styles. And it really sort of created something very interesting, which I thought worked really well for the story we were trying to tell. So we explored that a lot more in the interiors, actually, when you get into the separate spaces. But that was our idea to make it a sort of an eclectic pile of a mansion rather than one specific thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of eclectic, Wednesday and Enid's dorm room is complete opposites attract. It's like Wednesday's side is just dark and grays, blacks, and then Enid's is completely colorful. It's like Easter like threw up on it. So what was it like designing that room?
It was great. I mean, and the whole show was a lot of fun to design. And there was the first set I designed, and it was always going to be the hub for everything else. And it and nothing in Tim's sort of world is there's never too much information. It's also always very concise. Everything's got this sort of proscenium quality to it. And we wanted it to tell the story immediately, then in a sort of believable way. So we took the shell of the idea that they're up in the loft, and Enid's been up there on her own, and she's created this sort of glorious riot of color, and everything about her is just, her whole character is color. And she's done the stained glass window, and that's her world. And then the invasion of Wednesday into it sort of drains down one side to the point at which she then scrapes the color back on the windows, and you get this sort of perfect symmetry of the opposites, which we then sort of spread out through the show. So everything is about opposites and how they work together, and the conflict and everything that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jericho, the town, is the opposite too, because it looks like this like storybook idyllic town. So what was it like designing that?
Well, that was the ultimate extension. So we took the idea of the room and then just blew it up to the whole storyline. Jericho was interesting because when we first started, we were looking at locations, and we were scouting Toronto and trying to find towns that would let us sort of move in and take over, and we were finding places that sort of worked, and a little bit this worked, but then that didn't work. And Tim's so specific about how things work, and the script was very specific about all the different plot points and the devices. And the minute you started trying to unpick that and hang it on a real place, it all kind of didn't quite work. So when we pivoted and we moved to Romania, a lot to do with space as much as anything else, but suddenly it doesn't have any New England towns kicking around in Romania that we could jump into. So very quickly we realized we had to build it, and we had to build quite a lot of it, because we've got eight episodes. A lot happens in the town. There's a lot of plot points, a lot of places that needed to coexist. So we took over a lot of farmland next to the studio, leveled it, turned it into Jericho, which meant we could plot everything very precisely. So all the plot points, all the little bits.
Yeah, because you have like a weather vane, and
the weather vane on the corner, which is sort of everything happens around that. That was very important to be a composite set, because it would never have worked trying to do it in the studio and jump backwards and forwards. So that was built as a stage environment. So we had the ceilings all popped out, and it had studio lighting inside and everything else as well. But it was all composite. And we built, even the psychiatrist's office was up. We had parts of it up on the third floor where Wednesday could jump out, run across the rooftops, goes down the drain pipe. All that was built into the set. So there was very little CG elements on that. Even the church, we built everything composite because we were there so much. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to limit what they could shoot by saying, oh no, it's green screen over there or everything else. There was only really one aspect that wasn't complete, and that was looking back up the main street where you actually see Nevermore Academy off in the distance, sort of on the hillside.
Yeah.
But everything else was built for real. So
that's awesome. Well, I think Thing is the low-key star of the show. But and I understand like you guys actually had a hand actor play Thing.
Yes, it's rather fabulous.
But yeah, I think Victor Dorobantu is his name. But I guess how do you build elements of a set while keeping in mind that you're going to have a walking hand on set, and there's going to be close-ups of the hand and like the
it was interesting. Yeah. I mean, we didn't quite know we were designing everything and working towards, a shoot date and everything else, and they were still developing how they were going to do thing. And Tim is very keen to do as much practically as we can, and we could see it coming. And how is it going to be CG? Is it going to be this? Are we going to reference the hand actor and Victor? But then Victor was so great that Tim wanted him on set doing it for real. So suddenly we're into this world very similar to designing like the sets for the Muppets, where things have to be elevated, you have to have trapdoors, you have to have secret ways of getting the actor in, you have bits of the set have to fly, or you have to have half a desk, or there's endless different permutations of bits we had to come up with. And of course a lot of that was slightly happening on the fly because we didn't quite know where he was going to go, so we had to have endless options to give him that.
I know, because I was like, is he just like under a table right now? Like he's probably like contorting himself just to get like the movements
well,
right,
no,
right?
exactly. And we didn't, because he was he's obviously a character in his own right. So when he came onto the set, he would show Tim what he had in mind, maybe what we had in mind. So suddenly we were sawing holes in the walls or bringing out the half desk we had up our sleeve because we had a feeling this might happen. So it was there were so many scenes with him, and it was such a great performance. It became very much our job to keep up with it and give him the options to make that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, the season finale kind of tees up a second season. So what do you hope to see in a potential season 2?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think I'll be the last person to know about it when if that happens. But obviously what Alan Miles, the showrunners, have got in mind is a world where you could pick up any one of the characters within the show and exploit that. Everyone, it's such a rich world that they've created. It's very hard to say, but I think the options are there for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of avenues you can take, and not even just at Nevermore. I don't know about the spoiler or not, but
no,
sure.
I think there's a lot of different storylines you could pick up on there, definitely.
Yeah. Well, Mark, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you back here in a little bit.
Okay, lovely to talk to you.
Richard Bloom, production designer for Welcome to Chippendales. I think most people are familiar with the modern Chippendales and the Vegas show and all that, but this is an origin story and a tragic story at that, and set in the 80s. So how much did you know about this before the show?
Well, I actually knew quite a bit, thanks to my mother. My mother's a big fan of true crime and these murder shows. So I think I'd seen either a podcast or a Dateline about it. When I first went in to pitch the show, I had never worked with Rob Siegel and Jenny Connor, the two showrunners, and I got the script and I went in, and my biggest concern was, whether or not we were going to be, taking some artistic license or not with the show, because ultimately, like, it's a heart-wrenching American dream gone wrong. But and that was sort of the first thing that I went in. And once I knew that they were on board and they wanted to take as many liberties as possible to tell the story of these basically these two men who have very different dreams, and egos get in the way and it goes horribly wrong. Once I knew that we could kind of really latch onto that, and I had some freedom not to just recreate exactly things as they looked at the time, I got really excited about it. I mean, obviously it's set against such a surreal backdrop. The guys are, the dancing is so much fun, but there's a really dark, sinister undertone that creeps up on you, throughout the season, and it spirals out of control.
Mm-hmm. So I guess your mom was excited that you were working on this.
Yeah, she was pretty excited. I think everybody was. I mean, maybe not my sister so much, because my nieces probably won't be able to watch the show. Yeah. But so with the two, ultimately the story, for the people who don't know, Steve Banerjee, played by Kumail and Johnny, he never had the intention of starting a male dance club, but as it goes on, yeah, no, definitely, and as it goes on, he becomes so he's driven by his ego, whereas this other character, Nick DeNoia, played by Murray Bartlett, he also is chasing his American dream, but it's more about artistic freedom. So and as they splinter off, there's jealousy, and then ultimately things go horribly awry. So I knew that with Steve's character, like there were going to be a lot of, he's very money driven. I knew there was going to be a lot of scenes in his office. So the very first thing that I pitched was a two-story club, which was not how it was in Culver City originally. But I wanted to bring the nightclub into the office. So we have a lot of sequences where, and speaking with our DP Paolo Hodobro as well, like we wanted to be able to bring the club in and bring the swirl in. And as things go in, it becomes more and more, there's this backdrop behind him that there's always this movement, and there's through the disco balls and the light array. And I wanted it to feel, a bit surreal, because the story is pretty surreal. He meets his future wife at the bar, while right behind him there's men dancing, and the whole thing is tonally a little bit off.
I was wondering if the second floor was real, because I was like, that's really complex, but then it also makes sense when you describe, because like he is just so power hungry, like he wants to be number one, and like this
so we had one big stage out in Chatsworth where we built the club on one side of the stage, and then the other side of the stage we would always have like 4 or 5 sets that were constantly being ripped down and built up. When I first signed onto the show, and that was one of the challenges, actually, to watch the progression of the club. The show goes from 1979 through the 80s. And we wanted to we wanted to feel that without being too trapped in time by the real events. There are certain key elements that happen. The famous Chippendales calendars, which we recreated, and we did our version that'll put you in a place when the 1982 calendar is happening and the 1984 calendar happening. And those were just like a blast to do. We had 3 graphic designers on, Steve Salmon, Dorothy Street, and Mark Larkin, and recreating those with our prop master Jamie and Lynette McCown, our set decorator, were just super fun. And so you see this club progress over time as more and more neon comes in, and the advertisements
like lights
change.
and mirrors in the back.
And then full scale, like glowing posters of the guys and all that. But then in the juxtaposition of that, Nick splinters off and he goes to New York, and he's at a real crossroads in his life. So he's coming out of the closet. He's searching for sort of artistic, some sort of artistic, basically like becoming great
like
and letting the
expression,
world exactly. So we started him out. I started him out. We built him a mid-century house where he was living, because it's 1979. He's sort of living in the past. And then when he transitions to New York, I wanted to go into an Art Deco inspired world, which was also really leans heavily into the 80s Deco thing, and then see that sort of infuse into his performances, because basically there's a New York Chippendales and LA Chippendales at that point.
The New York Chippendales stage is completely different, because it's not a circular stage. It's just like
it's like a theater,
section.
Yeah, he's like a Broadway guy, and that's his dream. So he takes the club to a whole different level, and he's the real reason that that went on, and then that doesn't go so well with Nick.
I love that scene because we see the full Hunkenstein number with like the laboratory set. So how much fun was it to design that set?
Oh, it was so fun. We block shot the whole, we had 4 different directors, 2 episodes at a time. And I knew that was coming. And Nisha Ganatra shot that episode. And it was just such a fun time working with the choreographer and everyone, just like to put together that set and to make it. And then what you probably haven't seen in the next episode, the sets transform, and we really start to show the juxtaposition between the LA club, where Steve is spending just bare bones to keep packing the house, versus Nick, who's going all out and ultimately takes the show on the road. And we see the road tour as well, which was a lot of fun.
What do you have to keep in mind when you're designing a set for dance numbers? Because there are a lot of wide shots. We have to see the whole like choreography, full bodies and everything.
Yeah. Well, we work pretty closely with Michelle Johnson, who was the choreographer, in terms of knowing early on what the theme of the dances were, and how we wanted and what the action needed to happen. but yeah, I mean, obviously safety is a huge concern, but then also you want to have it be as dynamic and hilarious as possible, and give the directors that are stepping in, because a lot of times the design is happening prior to when our each director was prepping, so a lot of that was figured out, and we would always want to give them the best chance at a dynamic dance scene, as possible. And also I would like to also mention COVID, which was a crazy thing in the show, because we're at the height of COVID. We have 200 extras screaming every night.
I was wondering, because like the club is packed.
Yeah, it's packed, and that was tricky, because TV is a kind of a race to begin with, and I knew that this one was going to have some real things that could throw us off. So trying to get not only ahead of just the regular pace of television, but also being ready. And with only one stage, that became really challenging. We did have a couple of shutdowns. We had one shutdown for 10 days, which caused us having to take the club all the way to, the end moment, and then bring it all the way back to the beginning moment and then back again. So that made for a logistical sort of nightmare, but still really fun.
You have to adapt, yeah. So, I want to mention Steve's mansion, which was humongous, but also just so ostentatious, because it fits with his personality, that ego, like he just wants to be famous and wealthy. So was that a real mansion?
It's actually, so our stages were in Chatsworth, and that is not far away. That was actually a really great find by our location team, led by Eric Furstein. And I fell in love with it the second I saw it. In fact, we had scouted a house further down in this one gated community. And as we were driving out, we stopped, and I was like, we got to get into that house, because you could kind of see behind the gate. I was like, that looks really interesting. And sure enough, it just worked out. It was a really, really, it was a blessing, that house.
Yeah, because it was so wide and expanded. Like when you get to the backyard and the pool area, I was like, okay, this is bigger than I thought.
Yeah. Well, and that was important to Rob. He really wanted to show that jump, because basically we see the guys. We see Steve, and as he's spending so little on the club, we're seeing his life just sort of exorbitantly go up, which puts all this pressure on him, even more pressure on him. When a couple of things go wrong, it makes him to the point of where it drives him to insanity and to a point of,
and it's also a great juxtaposition with his the flashback, or not flashback, flashback, but when he goes to India early in the season.
Yeah. And when I signed up, I thought we were going to be traveling. I thought we were going to do a little time in New York and maybe actually shoot some in India. And then obviously with COVID and with our budget restrictions, we ended up doing it all in and around Chatsworth. So that was a challenge, but also a really fun challenge, recreating Bombay on the streets of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite performance number from the show?
I do, and I think it's towards the very end. So I'll save that one. But there's some good.
Everyone will keep an eye out for it. So.
Yeah, there's some good ones in every episode, and but towards the very end, our last director, Richard Shepard, really did some fun stuff.
Well, Richard, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and you get to stay on because everyone's back. Welcome to our Meet the Experts TV production panel. Today, we're joined by Matthew Davies from 5 Days at Memorial, Ramsey Avery from The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Mark Scruton from Wednesday, and Richard Bloom from Welcome to Chippendales. Thank you all for being here. Well, Ramsey, before you said you're on a location scout at the moment and you're taking a break, so we appreciate you making the time. But I was curious, like what goes into a location scout and finding what you need and getting the clearance to shoot there and then maybe change some things around. Why don't we start with you, Ramsey?
I guess that depends a lot on what the particular scene is that we're looking for. I mean, in Lord of the Rings, everything comes, it's all fantasy, right? So and there you can't go down the street in Auckland and find a place to shoot. So we ended up, one of the tricks we had to do, though, is because we weren't able to travel the breadth of New Zealand like they did in the movie. So we ended up figuring out a lot of times how to make a sheep paddock outside of Auckland look like something else. So what we would look for is a couple of things. One, what are the bones? Does it have really good graphic shapes in terms of what we're trying to have this scene say? Where's the light coming from? so the DP can put the camera in the right place to make sure the characters have the right feeling with that, or that he's able to control the lighting in the right way that he needs to be able to get the scene to work. And once we find, does it have the right look? Can we get the right lighting to it? Then is it controllable? How much can we do to it? In New Zealand in particular, each location is not only bound by the owner of the location, but there's a local council that you have to go through for all kinds of regulations, rules. And oftentimes, in many cases in the exteriors, you're also dealing with the Maori tribal regulations as well. So there's a series of regulations and bureaucracy that you'd have to work through to understand what you could and you couldn't do in each locations. And they passed a new water regulation law while we were there. So some of the things that we had planned to do along the stream side, we ended up not being able to do and having to figure out a different way to do it. So it's a mix of what's the right look and what can we make happen.
It's always the red tape somehow, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and in a very different way, we were up against the same thing. There were several places that were fantastic reproductions of the Donahue set, but they were churches and they wouldn't allow the male dancing. So as you can imagine. So, and then also on certain levels of television, I find that, we're doing 2 or 3 company moves a day. So you really have to break down the script and really figure out what's going to make the most visual impact with that first location, and then how you can anchor that and spin off without having to relocate base camp. And that's where a lot of the creativity gets in, where it's like you're building a bathroom set in the, in the lobby of a bank or whatever, where you're having to really think outside the box, where you have these few locations that are the linchpins of the episode, and then you're building out from there.
Mm-hmm, sure. Matthew, how about you?
Well, 5 Days at Memorial was a difficult show in that regard. We were trying to recreate a lot of the very iconic moments that were captured by news footage from the time of Katrina. Out of a 6-month shoot, we actually shot only about 2.5 weeks in New Orleans. The rest of it was shot in Toronto, which is obviously a very different city, very different climate. So, we, from a location finding standpoint, we're always very hopeful going in that we're going to find great locations that are adaptable to our needs. And, we certainly spent and actually wasted quite a bit of time trying to find, the perfect stairs to helipads, the right configuration of wards. We were also shooting during COVID. So, everything was in this heightened state of lockdown. So to actually get into a practical hospital and actually make that our environment, particularly when we had, Hurricane Katrina, which is the largest storm to ever make landfall in the US, and then to track 5 days of deterioration following that on a practical location, would be very hard. So we ended up shooting actually in one location, Branson Hospital in North Toronto, which made up some of the smaller kind of moments of the hospital. But we also built a 45,000 square foot hospital and studio, which included 3 levels of the hospital. And that sort of became our sort of main focus. And it was very much about, trying to bring authenticity into those moments of recreating. We had a great location manager, Scott Alexander, but, we were very specific as to what we were asking him to find for us. And, we were very limited just because of, in our story had 2,000 people sheltering in a hospital. The practicalities of shooting during COVID is that we weren't allowed more than 50 extras. A lot of the previs work was about, trying to strategically plan to always suggest a much larger, deeper, more encompassing environment than we actually had at our disposal. So yeah, we ended up building an awful lot, whether it was in backlot conditions or in studio. We didn't have a ton of practical locations, but the ones that we did find, we were basing them very specifically on research photos we had of the actual homes of people that had endured this terrible ordeal.
Yeah, for sure. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Richard was right. You were always trying to build packages for these shows of one key location that then can suit you for 2 or 3 other ones. And it's whenever I go out scouting, you've always narrowed it down to a small group anyway. Then you turn up and you try and figure out whether the location will fit the beats you're trying to get out of it, and whether you can go from A to B to C, and whether it has all those elements. And then you look at it holistically and say, well, this is actually worth us doing this work to this location to do it. Does it give us the value we want, or is it scrap? So I normally like to go to the director with 2 or 3 options. Here's all of these 3 work. This is the one that's really great. These 2 not so great, but actually this one gives you 2 other options to do something else as well. So there's always that going on. But then you have other examples, like with an Evermore Academy, where we spent ages driving around the countryside looking at these little huge castles. And with County Casino, which was our final choice, Tim fell in love with it, and no matter what else we showed him, this was always the one. However, it was a massive tourist trap and completely surrounded by sort of souvenir stalls and restaurants and gazebos, and COVID had meant it had all these outdoor dining areas, and the whole thing was just completely obliterated by other stuff. But Tim loved it, so then to the world of negotiations of how, not normally a place I like to be. Normally you like to take a director somewhere where you can do all this stuff. However, we were in the sort of reverse world where suddenly we had to negotiate to remove all this stuff and pare it right back. So a lot of time was spent getting rid of all the gack that was there. But it's an interesting process, and it's never quite one size fits all with these things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know most things aren't functional on sets, but sometimes they are, like light switches or something. So how do you decide what to make functional and not? And how important is it, especially to help the actors get into the real space, so to speak? Richard, was there anything functional on the Chippendales set?
I mean, light switches not so much, but yes, most everything else is. We try and make it as tactile, and obviously the script will move you forward. One trick that you have when you're doing something period, like Chippendales is that everything becomes the guts of the computers and the safe itself and the cash register. We had a lot of issues with all these beautiful period cash registers. Some of them would work and some of them wouldn't. And there's obviously a lot of scenes around the merchandising area. So and that we spend a lot of time on that stuff, getting that stuff approved. Obviously Jamie Minguell, our prop master, is like one of the best, and set decorator Lynette McCowan as well. And so we're working with the showrunners. They've seen it all. We've done all of those. We've done all those show and tell, so there's no surprises on the day. But there's always some surprise on the day where all of a sudden the actor changes the blocking and they want to go over to the closet and they open the door, and you've maybe dressed it a little bit but you haven't dressed the whole thing. So you're always ready. You're always ready at call for rehearsal.
Ramsey, how about you? Anything in Middle Earth?
Well, one of the things that we definitely dealt with a lot was fire, because in terms of being able to light our environments, we either had the choice of sunlight or we had flame. At least it had to look like it was sunlight or flame. So we spent a lot of time figuring out how to do fire practically and how to do it safely and how to actually use it to light scenes and how to then direct or correct the color of the flame for each environment that it needed to be in. One of my favorite things is I found this spectacular reference piece for a wall of oil lanterns, little oil lamps kind of things, and just filled the whole wall of it. And so, of course, I wanted to do that because it was beautiful in one of the sets, and that meant that the special effects Dean was just fantastically figured out how to power gas to each one of those oil lanterns, so it's actually gas and controllable. It can be turned off, and to make it even better, it had to actually have a camera come through that wall. So that whole wall, which was 15 feet tall and 25 feet wall, actually had to be on rails to be able to be moved in and out to be able to get the camera in. So his whole rig had to also be able to move in and out with that, and just a spectacular bit of engineering. He was really a bit of a wizard, actually. A real life wizard.
Oh my gosh, that's
awesome.
Cool. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, I think everything you put on a set, you try and have as practical as possible, because you're always going to get caught out if it isn't. We had a slight issue because obviously we went to be in America and we brought tons of stuff in from America, container loads of props. But nothing kind of matched wiring wise with the Romanian wiring systems. So that was always interesting. We had a lot of time converting everything to run off different power grids and everything else, which was a real pain. But on the show as a whole, Tim liked everything to be practical. So if something tree burst into flames, the tree had to burst into flames. If the statue was mechanical, it had to be mechanical, not CG. So pretty much everything that you see in the show is doing it for real. There's very little CG enhancement. I'm sure the VFX guys won't like me for saying that, but there's a lot of touch up, but everything was physical and real and was on set doing what it was supposed to do.
I think you can definitely tell when you watch it. So
good.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Matthew, I mean, you kind of had to do the opposite where things broke down and didn't work.
Yeah, although they had to work up to a point. John Ridley, one of our directors, was extremely method. So if a patient was in bed and the phone rang next to the bed, it had to ring. The actor had to pick it up, and there had to be
a person on the line
on the other end of it. And he was adamant that everything should play out realistically in real time. So all of the video playback was live. It was at the old kind of resolution that we're familiar with in the early 2000s. All the cell phones that people were using, which were early 2000s cell phone, had to be networked. So they were working cell phones, that people could, there was a lot of hospital equipment, obviously, that breaks down as power is lost in the hospital. But, we had great medical advisors. We created prosthetics wherever there was intubation going on. And, they were trying to show how forceful and brutal it was to actually care for patients without the convenience of electricity or air conditioning. So, we created those as very realistic prosthetic corpses. I mean, ultimately they became corpses. And yeah, I mean, we always, wherever there was actor interaction with the hurricane conditions around the hospital, that was all as real as we could make it, with Ritter fans, VW fans, and brain towers and drip rigs and air cannons and everything else that would make the performances feel as real as possible. So yeah, we always strive for.
You had old school cell phones working.
Yeah, we actually had to get them.
That's awesome. Well, lastly, I know a lot of production designers often create backstories for their characters or sets or rooms, like why this person would have this thing right here. So what are some of your favorite backstories that you've come up with, whether on your current project or a past one? Mark?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think on Wednesday, most of the characters had backstories. I mean, Larissa Weems, who was the principal, was kind of interesting because there were hints of that in the script, but we've tried to get sort of, it's hard because I can't really go into it without spoilers, but we try to get elements of that into the set so you can piece together bits, and there's little elements on her desk that give her the backstory of the twists and turns that have led her to where she is. And I think that was kind of important for her because she's the sort of the linchpin for the whole school. So it was really important to give her that characterization without really saying much about it. Yes, there's too many spoilers.
I know that's a good tease though, so people can, now that they have incentive to watch now. So Ramsey, how about you? You also come from a project with a lot of heavy backstory. So did you do anything in particular?
Well, I guess we very few times we actually got to go into somebody's real house. With the Harfoots, of course, and Bronwyn in the Southlands. For the most part, a lot of the spaces were more kind of commercial or public kind of spaces. So being able to dig deeply into those backgrounds in a lot of cases wasn't that specific. It was more about trying to dig into the backgrounds of the cultures to make sure that there was a lot of that backstory there, particularly for the fan base who is fairly fervent and knows their stuff. So that trying to figure out ways to integrate things that would be true to the storytelling that Tolkien brought in. One example would be the dwarves were created, I won't go into this in very great depths, but they were created by a specific god, and that god's wife is the goddess of nature, and they didn't want to insult the goddess of nature, so they wouldn't use a lot of wood. They didn't, and one of the gods actually told one of the other gods that, you know, your children that you've created are going to destroy your wife's woods. And so the dwarves have made a decision that they're not going to actually use wood hardly at all in anything. So trying to figure out how to make furniture and shore up tunnels using petrified wood or metal or onyx, or, you know, how do you tell that bit? And so it's looking into the legendarium in a lot of ways to figure out how that informs the broader decisions going into the underlying nature of the sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Matthew and Richard, you guys are dealing with real stories in this particular case for your show. So what did you guys take any liberties with any like home designs or anything? Matthew?
For sure.
Go ahead. Whoever wants to
start. We for sure did. I mean, Nick's character in general, which is it's his journey. He's coming out of the closet. He's coming into his own. You know, we tried to have all the artwork throughout his place be evocative of this sexual liberation and artistic liberation that he was going through. He also, in real life, had won an Emmy for
he's won two, as he'll remind everyone.
Yes, exactly. He's won two. And so we had this beautiful little brass unicorn that played throughout all his travels. He takes it on the road with him and everywhere. And just little moments like that, working with our decorator to try and, like, you know, push the story even forward even more on his journey.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really have to credit my set decorator, Jared Dick, and my art director of graphics, Michaela Shane, for all the incredible work that they did to research each character and to make sure that all those little nuances and details that we had gleaned from Sherry Fink's research, that all that sort of really came across in their environments. I mean, it's something we do in this business. We work at trying to create as much of a tangible backstory to characters, to you know, really give them a sense of authenticity in the narrative. And that's you know, it's there in all of our work. You know, I've done very stylized shows like, you know, Hannibal for NBC, which was, you know, a very rarefied aesthetic, and then shows like 5 Days at Memorial, which is very much entrenched in authenticity. And you know, we always work really hard to make sure that all those details are there for people that care to see them.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap, but thank you so much for your time today. It was great speaking with all of you, and congratulations on all of your projects.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you very much.
So much.